As you may be aware, many employees feel underappreciated not only because their work is not recognized, but more importantly, because their abilities aren't. You see, people bring all kinds of gifts to the workplace every single day, and those gifts go unappreciated and underutilized. When people feel this way, they disengage and they check out. And you can change this through my assets inventory for the enterprise program. Using proven community development techniques, you can take better stock of the talent you have, their abilities that they want to contribute, and find creative ways of connecting these abilities and these capacities to your organizational strategy, which in the end creates a win for everyone. This is the best way to improve your employee experience and make for more connected workplaces. So contact me, Gary David, at gary@garyconnects.com to learn how you can inventory the gifts your employees have to give and create more connected workplace communities. Now, on to the show.
1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Gary David. Welcome to Experience by Design, the podcast where we explore experience designs of all kinds. Hello, experience designers and members of the EXD community. Hope you're all doing well. By the time you hear this, by the time you're listening to this, I should be in Florence, Italy, visiting my daughter who is studying abroad. I've never been to Italy, and by extension of that, I've never been to Florence. So there is going to be a lot to experience while there. And hopefully there'll be some fun tales to tell afterwards. But having stories to tell is different from being able to tell stories. It is an art to be able to tell a good story, one that not only keeps people engaged, but also transmits some knowledge or even a lesson as well. Stories are one of the best ways to share knowledge in a way that is relatable and impactful. And if you don't believe me, just go take a look at any major religion or minor religion for that matter, and you'll find a lot of stories that are meant to influence people's perspectives and their behaviors. One of the things that I've learned from doing this podcast is that everyone has a story to tell. I've also learned that sometimes people need some assistance telling their story. That assistance can be limited to just some conversational prompts on a podcast or a longer-term mentoring about how to put those stories into writing. I've long been interested in this thing that I call public scholarship, taking what I know as an academic and putting it into terms that a broader public can be engaged in. Now, as an academic, I also know that my communication style has been heavily influenced by academic writing, which if you've ever tried to read that style, you will know that it isn't conducive to engagement or understanding. So you could say I need a little help with telling my story. That's why I partnered with Eric Koester and his company Manuscripts. That's also why I'm having him as a guest on EXT today. Eric started Manuscripts from an experiment that he ran while teaching a college class. The assignment for all of his students in that class was to write a book by the end of the semester. From that process came the idea of a larger effort to help people tell their stories. And that has resulted in 3,500 plus published authors, 350 plus national and international book award winners and finalists, and a 90% manuscript completion rate. I might add that Manuscripts is also a certified B Corp. And I will also add that all the students in that original class, in fact, did write a book. Eric and I cover a lot of ground in this conversation. We discuss the limits of modern-day education and how to design more impactful learning experiences. A key is to connect with people's interests and passions. Eric shares findings from his research on inflection points in people's careers, highlighting that substantive, collaborative projects are key to achieving such points. Eric emphasizes the need for projects that can be packaged and completed, such as a 12-episode podcast season or a 200-page book, rather than just starting with smaller tasks like a blog or a single podcast episode. In our conversation, Eric also discusses the importance of a systems approach in achieving goals, particularly in writing books and dissertations, and highlighted Manuscripts B Corp certification as part of its mission to empower underheard authors. And I will also mention that that was one of the things that really attracted me to working with manuscripts. We discuss the principles of creating knowledge movements and thought leadership through books. And Eric explains that successful movement-driven books typically teach either a new type of person to aspire to be or a new type of action to aspire to do, both of which emphasize the importance of simplicity and intrigue. And I can say for me that working with Eric in manuscripts has been extremely helpful in getting me to tell the stories that I have been wanting to share for a long time, hopefully in a way that inspires new kinds of people and new kinds of actions to lead to experience design movements. It was a really fun conversation. Hope you enjoy it. I don't know if you ever go back over your old blogs, but I was on your website. I'm on it right now. And it was really useful because there's a blog about building a syllabus for your startup. And I said, I need that because I need to build a syllabus. Not for a class, which is kind of a startup, I guess, but I need to build a syllabus for my class. So I was actually going through here and rethinking how I approach that syllabus building, because I don't know about you teaching, but I find that because I've done it a way, that's the way I think I should do it, or that's the way I've seen it done, and needing a fundamental rethink about what a syllabus is, what it's meant to do, and what inspires its content beyond just the regulatory language that I need to put in there, but also be inspirational, because if there's one thing that's the least inspirational part of a semester, it's syllabus day.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right.
Which should be the best part of the day. It should be like exciting, fun. This is what we're going to be doing. And syllabus day is it just feels like almost going over your mortgage terms.
Yeah, I agree.
So how do you approach syllabus day? Because you just started this semester, at Georgetown, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I do really honestly is I do think about a great course should drive transformation. So the funny thing is I think like a lot of people, I started teaching very normally. It's like there's a set of things I'm supposed to do, and I pulled other people's syllabi. And I think the challenge with it is it's basically an information architecture. How do you deliver content and a schedule in that way? And I think that what I really started to figure out is I always build towards the very last day, which is sort of a penultimate thing. So I think about this as an arc where the last day of class should be something that there's a celebration, there's an accomplishment, there's an achievement, and oftentimes there's some kind of a deliverable that goes from there. So I sort of think in the reverse, which is like, what is the thing that we're going to celebrate at the end together, and the steps to get there in that sense. And I think it sort of has made my course development much more experiential and much more designed around something that has almost a culmination, but with that idea of here's the way that you can demonstrate your transformation. And so every class that I build, I think about here's the demonstration. So I typically have some kind of a presentation, some kind of a deliverable, some kind of a thing. And if we do it right, there should be some kind of a party after. And that's the general vibe that I have, is what's the transformation you can demonstrate at the end is how I build, and what are all the steps to build us there.
I think it's helpful because, it's once you're stuck in a culture of a profession, then it becomes very repetitive and duplicative, right? Or derivative, right? It's like, okay, this is how we do the thing, and this is how the semester goes, and this is a culminating thing. It's final exam day, and you have an exam, you do presentations. And again, even I've seen situations where the final day is performatory, right? Or perfunctory. Right. It's just, let's just get out of here so we can get done and I can get grades in. So I think you coming in with a fresh perspective on that, it's collaborative. It's not something that's performative.
Well, I think, I mean, it also gets me in trouble a little bit. I mean, I've been politely moved from departments because it doesn't feel like pedagogy to some people.
Right.
I think I think taking a step back in general, I think education as a general ecosystem is in a really interesting point right now, where historically education has been all about credentialing, right? It's that you get a degree so that then people believe that you have a degree. And so a lot of it really is this idea of like like, we are going to, let you into our prestigious institution. And then if you make it through the gauntlet, well, then that signals to the outside world. And so Michael Spence won a Nobel Prize on this thing called the signaling theory. And if you're familiar with the signaling theory, it really talks about the idea that the most important thing that employers can look at if they're looking to sort of see who they should hire or not is how prestigious is the school that they attended. And so that's really the whole culmination of education theory has been built on Michael Spence's, 1970s, Nobel Prize winning signaling theory. And so that is really why we've seen a huge amount of focus on applying to the best schools and a huge amount of focus on getting in and the whole cottage industry around it. And the challenging thing to reality tell you, though, is when you actually look from the employer side of what actually matters of who'll be successful, what school you went to is like number 19 on the list. It's like the least most important thing for people. So I think the challenging thing is we're now moving to a point where we have more data, we have more information. We know actually from a data standpoint that it is not actually what school you went to that signals success of your career path. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Like what they found is that, this thesis of you go to an Ivy League school and therefore the network effects will benefit you. There was a research study that was done, and it's sort of the subtext of it is called the Tulane study, or the Tulane effect. And basically what they wanted to figure out is what mattered, like what really matters in success. So this thesis of like, go to a great school, that's the most important thing, that's the unlock. And so it's really hard to understand whether that's true or not, right? We just don't have we can't look to see if you didn't go to that school, what would happen. So what the researchers did is they actually took a whole data set of people, and they didn't just ask them what school they went to. They asked them what school they got into and what school they went to. So the interesting thing is they took this whole pool of people and they started to identify people who had gotten into elite schools and went, and they compared them to people who had gotten into elite schools and gone to a lesser ranked school. So you got into Harvard and you decided for whatever reason, economics, money, whatever, to go to Tulane. And they wanted to understand, like, okay, what really is the value of the Ivy League network or the elite school network behind it? So they compared those people. The fascinating study point, zero difference in terms of wealth, outcomes, happiness, they were the same. So the real thing to know about it is it's what you do, not where you did it. Right. And that's, I think, a lot of what happens today is people get fixated on this idea of like, oh gosh, I got to go to this great place because that's the unlock. And my whole learning in all this sort of stuff is I would much rather a person do something interesting no matter where they are as opposed to be somewhere they're supposed to be. And so a lot of the way I design courses in that way is how can you have something that is demonstratable beyond just the name of the place you went. And so for me, a lot of the courses I designed, and again, it's sort of one of the things that, I've been recognized for publicly is I took a class of entrepreneurship and I told them this semester, you're not going to launch a company or try think about it. I'm going to help you launch a book. Yeah. And so this idea of helping people start to build things and outputs and outcomes has been the thing that sort of I learned. But I think it really comes down to the fundamentals of today's success is not about where you do things, it's what you do there. And that's the sort of big thing I look at when I design courses, when I design experiences, really when I talk to anyone about success today. It's not where you did it, but it's what you did.
Yeah, it really causes us to think about the motivation of why people are there and how we get them engaged and how we sell them on what we want them to do while they're there. So I sometimes will use jobs to be done framework, and my peers will say, my professional peers will say, people come here to get an education. I'm like, no, they don't. They come here to get a degree, a credential, right? That's why they come here. Yep. We have to convince them that they should get an education while they're here, right? And what that means is, I like that point you said, is do something interesting. Right. And when I assign students, whatever it is going to be their projects, I'm like, be brilliant, do something interesting. Don't ask me what you should do. Convince me that what you're doing is worth doing. Yeah. And giving them the skills and the tools to do that. And, the idea of demonstrating it, one of the things I had to rethink was, why am I having students write research papers when none of them are going to write research papers? So I completely shifted to say, you're not allowed to write research papers. You have to use visual design principles to create polished professional documents that people who are not academics would want to engage with. And that causes them, and sometimes they have a hard time with it because they are so rooted in a product equals research paper. I'm like, no, you need to create content that connects with a broader audience that you want to convince.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it's just sort of, and I'll give you proof behind this a little bit. So some of my research, I study a phenomenon called the inflection point. And so the inflection point is really something that I have spent a lot of time trying to understand is, what is it about certain people who are going along and then they have this acceleration? They have this some sort of thing that happens in their lives. And candidly, it's what happened to me. I mean, I was sort of going along having, fine public success, but really there was this inflection point where now suddenly I'm teaching in a school I couldn't have got into. I'm serving on boards. I get hired, by venture capital firms, like all these things. And so the question that I always wanted to figure out is what happens? Like, what is that thing that leads to these inflection points? And so I started studying this. And the biggest question, again, I wanted to understand is, why do certain people have these inflection points in life? And what is the cause for them, these rapid periods of acceleration that you see? And so the way I designed this was quite interesting. I wanted to look at a set of people who'd had this sort of public inflection point young. And so I went out and I studied the Forbes 30 under 30. So I studied this group of people that Forbes has recognized for the last decade as exceptional. And people can take issues with the list, but it doesn't really matter in this case. But these are, every year they recognize somewhere around 500 to 800 people that they've identified from the market of people being exceptional. And so this was about a 6,000 person study. And I wanted to understand what was different about these people. Right? If the goal for me as an educator and as someone who's really trying to help inspire other people is, these people have these inflection points. Is it something that I can help others have inflection points? Right? That was my whole goal, is how do I help people have inflection points? If I am as an educator, if I as someone who's coaching people, if I'm helping to try to make my time worth doing, how do I make sure that I maximize the number of inflection points behind? So it's not get them on the Forbes 30 and 30 list, but whatever that list would be. So the research started out saying, like, what makes this group different, right? What makes these people unusual? So the first thesis I had was, maybe all these people went to really good schools, right? Maybe that's it. Maybe it's the idea of going to an elite school is that. And so we looked, and of these 6,000 people, we found that only about 15% of them went to a top 10 institution. So certainly these people did go to great institutions, but there was over 650 different colleges and universities represented on this list. So it wasn't the college thing. There wasn't a mass clustering of, if you go to an Ivy League school, you'll have that one. So the second theory that we had was, well, maybe these people, they didn't get into the best schools, but they went to better graduate schools. And so they clustered around graduate schools, those sorts of things. We were wrong again. In fact, what we found then is there's more people on the list who dropped out of college or never went than went to graduate school, right? So it wasn't a graduate school thing either. The third theory we have is, maybe all these people were, teenage entrepreneurs. They were starting companies really young, having the success. Also not what we found, right? Many of them had started companies, had organizations in that way, but they oftentimes happened later. What we found was, the common pattern that we discovered is, this group of people had what we call substantive projects, substantive collaborative projects. 84% of them had these projects that we identified as really leading to this inflection point. And the fascinating thing is that those were the things that really sparked the inflection point. The year before the inflection point, these were the people who were writing and publishing a book. These were people who were launching a podcast. They were doing a video show. They were doing some kind of research they were publishing. They were putting on an event. There were these sort of demonstrable projects. And what we started to learn about these projects, it ties back to what you said, is the most important thing if you want to have kind of an acceleration is, you have to build a way to drive collaboration, and you have to drive a flywheel of perception. And so what we discovered in the research is, what happens in these sort of projects is, there's a couple of things that are common across the projects. The projects that we saw people succeed, and they were designed. They were designed for these acceleration pieces, even if they didn't fully realize it. And now what's neat is we can actually teach people how to do it. But the first thing these had is, number one, they were not projects done for money, right? It wasn't that I'm starting this company. It was something that I wanted to do to learn, to explore, something in that one. So not primarily for money. They were substantive. They were projects that took the person around 6 to 12 months to finish. So there are things that you could finish. You could finish a podcast season. You could finish an event. You could finish a book. You could finish, some kind of a prototype. So they were finishable. The third thing that was really important too is these were all things that were tied to some kind of a passion, something I wanted to learn or do in that way. And the fourth and probably the most important thing is all of these had a collaboration element to them. They all were collaborative. So they required people to participate in it. And the reason this worked is because of what we now coin, we call it the grit growth mindset flywheel. What starts to happen when young people, or really anyone, starts to use projects, they start to use these demonstratable projects in that way, public demonstratable projects, is two things start to happen. Number one, when you do hard things, right? Like publishing a book is hard. 99% of people that start one will never finish it. So when you finish something hard publicly, your own self-perception of your growth mindset, what's possible for you, changes. So you go from having a belief that you could do some things to you could do hard things. Now you've done something harder than most people. So it changes what you believe is possible. But the other part of it is important. You are demonstrating that. When you do something public like this, when you publish a book, 99% of people fail at, now people see you as someone who's gritty. You have a public demonstration of your grit. You can do something hard. So people's perception of you changes. And so they ask you to do harder things and you take them because you can, and the flywheel continues. So the reason the inflection points happen for people who do these projects, they're going on a steady line. They pick this project that they do it well, they do it, and then the flywheel starts. And suddenly now they start getting asked to do cool things, and they take those things and they do more. And so the flywheel starts to accelerate for people. So you can actually manufacture your own inflection point by picking a project. So the year before you want something cool to happen, you start a project, you build this kind of, again, project that you want to do publicly, demonstrate in that way, and then suddenly it changes. And that's what happened. So with my students, we started, building this into the way we teach people, the results started to get crazy, right? Like people suddenly are having, opportunities to speak at the UN, and they're suddenly having these opportunities to do TED Talks. And a lot of it really comes down to the fact that you've unlocked their inflection point so that now the perception of them is they're gritty. And so you give them opportunities, and your belief that you could do it, it also comes. So you take those things. And that's where the flywheel really happens for people.
I'm eyeing the Forbes 100 over 100 because I figure by that time, the number of people over 100 years old, it's going to be pretty small. So I have a pretty good shot at being 100 over 100 list.
That's the thing. Aim for what you can, right? Shoot low, my friends.
I'm playing the long game here. It's going to be a one through attrition. And not a quick attack. But yeah,
Dave Barry once said, "Shoot low, boys. They're riding Shetland ponies." So that is my. There you go.
I love that. No, it's the thing about that, and I want to talk about your company Manuscripts, is this idea of collaboration and the notion that working together. I mean, it's interesting. One of the mythos that we have in the United States is that genius is something that is individual. Right. That it's Alexander Graham Bell toiling alone by himself in his lab, ignoring that there was a thing called Bell Labs. Right. That it's genius is often occurring in concert with others. It's not just this lone individual. So working with others as a way of not just maintaining individual accountability, but spurring action, but also support.
Right. Well, also, I think, and I think that's really what was interesting about this is I think there's sort of a well-known and well-understood sense of that humans need accountability, right? The idea that, if you really want to get in shape, you hire a personal trainer, not just get a gym membership, right? That I think is understood. I think what's interesting and what we were most surprised about in the research behind it is the fact that level of collaboration, when you collaborate with someone who is more senior than you, who is outside of your circles behind it, is the power of the network effects of that, right? That was really what I think I was surprised at. I think certainly we understand peer accountability and why that really matters in getting things done. But what we've discovered is that the amplification effect is important. So going back to Michael Spence's signaling theory, we talked at the beginning about this idea that the most important signal that you can have is that I went to this school. So therefore I must be, validated in some way, shape or form, right? Which leads to a bunch of things. But that idea of like, this is the signal that you use to hire on. What we've realized here is that people who are doing projects, they're actually creating their own signal. So rather than borrowing signal from an institution, what's happening, right? I go to this school, I'm borrowing their signal, and that's what I'm using to get what I want. Right. Now, today, people have the ability to create signal. And that signal is what spreads and pings out there. So suddenly now, people are always surprised. Like, why are your students getting all these opportunities? Why are these things happening? It's because they're not reliant on borrowed signal. They're creating their own signal. And those signals are what allow people to say, oh my God, gosh, like you're 21, but I want you to be my head of product, or you're 22. I now want you to come talk at this conference. And so the idea in today's world is really understanding the difference between borrowed signal, which certainly has value, right? Going to things and being a part of things like I worked at Google still means something to enough people that I understand it. But the true success today, when you look at people who are achieving inflection points, they're creating signal. And those signals that they're creating are now attracting more opportunities. That's what leads to this rapid acceleration.
One of the interesting things about this, and maybe it's because recently I launched an episode with a person who was an officer in a submarine, that idea of signal to noise ratio, right? Because if everyone's creating signal, if everyone's creating their own signal, there's a lot of noise. So then it becomes a question of how do you create a signal that has resonance, that people can identify? And this is where I think, going back to what your point was, one of the points you made, which is, it's not just me throwing a podcast out into the world and hoping. It's all, it's not just me putting it on socials because everyone's putting it on socials. It's also having others who I'm engaged with who can help support that through their networks. And then we get into this social network theory of branching those effects out like the cascade of ripples in a pond.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what's important as well, right? I think especially when you really understand the constructs around, signaling theory, all these things, is that really what the important thing to know in all of this is if you want to create high signal outcomes, number one, you have to do things that are substantive, right? And I think that's one of the things you talked about, putting out a podcast episode. So a podcast episode is fine. It really is. But I think part of it is if you can package that up into a podcast season, right? Or you can package up, we don't just do, sort of a get together. We package this up into an event that we can. So the idea of creating this demonstrative signal is important to rise above that noise. And so usually, like I said, I think the things that we see when you're looking at what actually creates the real signal today, the real created signal, is they are substantive, right? They are usually things that take 6 to 12 months. And the way I encourage people to think about that when they're trying to think about what to do next, right? Whatever that thing is don't say, I'm going to launch a blog, right? So the example is people, listen, I'm going to launch a blog this year. Please don't, because the reason is you can never finish a blog, right? Don't say I'm going to launch a podcast because you can never finish a podcast. The big thing you want to do is if you're going to do a project that's going to hopefully lead to an inflection point, do something that has a number in front of it, right? I'm going to launch a 12 episode podcast season. I'm going to launch a 200-page book. I'm going to do a 150 person event. I'm going to do, whatever it is, insert your thing, but having something you can package up is what creates the substantive signal so that people talk about it. People don't talk about a podcast episode, but they say, hey, I've got a season on blank. That's really what changes things, especially if you're looking at what creates that noise, that signal above all the noise today.
Yeah, it should make a lot of sense, right? And it does make a lot of sense because we grew up watching television, and television is packaged into seasons.
Yep.
And so it's not just episode. It's like, oh, here's a season. I've completed the season, and the person who's engaging with it feels like they accomplished something as well. So you're not only extending your signal, but you're creating the opportunity for them to have a sense of completion by finishing the thing that you're creating.
We talk a lot about this idea of launchable moments, right? How do you have launchable moments in your life? And I think that's why, as you go back to the beginning of how I design courses today, is I want to have a launchable moment, something that we can say we did together, right? Even if it's, I do a day-long workshop, at the end of it, I'm going to have something that we're going to have a victor, we're going to have someone who gets recognized behind it. And so when you design everything around the idea of launching something that has a sense of accomplishment, it starts to change. Psychologically, humans need closure, right? Number one. But number two, I think the other thing is that when you accomplish something, right? When you finish something, the sense of that accomplishment changes your internal perception. The growth mindset unlocks. I launched this company to a bunch of venture investors behind it. And so that's really what changes. So if we really want to help our own selves grow, it's that you want to have more launchable moments in your life so that then you can launch something better and different and more. And that's the big sort of structuring behind all of it.
You sound like a sociologist in a way, and I don't mean this to sound insulting, so hang with me here for a second. The idea of, sometimes, especially this kind of sociology that I do, people have called like sociology of the obvious, right? Or every day. It's like, the finding isn't the unique diamond that I uncovered. The finding is the making obvious what is in front of everyone else,
Right.
but they haven't
Right.
seen. And that anybody listening to this, I think, would be like, well, yeah, obviously.
Makes perfect sense, right?
Right. But then why don't people do it? Why is
That's
it,
right.
why has
That's
it gotten lost? And I think that's why
Yeah.
you sound like a sociologist to me, is that you're uncovering this thing that when you say it makes all the sense in the world and seems perfectly clear, but yet people haven't on their own tracked it or latched onto it. And why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we really, I always I use the phrase from James Clear is, we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. And so I think in many cases, these sort of things that matter today, there's not generally like a system to do it, right? For thinking about doing an event, right? Like there's not really like a system to say, here's how I'm going to put on a conference, right? You don't have a system that you can do that's just obvious you plug into. Or, when you started this podcast, there was no system, right? You just had to figure it out, right? There's no system to write a book behind it. And so I think a lot of what has happened is these things have high signals because historically they required just a lot of chutzpah and a lot of grit to make it through.
Right.
And I think that's really what it is when you recognize hard things out in the market, right? And that's part of what this all comes down to is doing hard things. And so let's contrast a little bit of the thing of like, I go and I get a college degree versus I go and I publish a book, right? Those things. And so the interesting thing about getting a degree today and what's different than like think in the 1500s is there's a system. I basically go, I can, do the things, I show up to class. It's really, really hard to fail at going to college. I mean, a lot of people do, but the truth of the matter is like, hard. if you show up, if you come to class, if you basically just, do a little bit of stuff, there's a whole system here that's designed to help you achieve it. Right. So the system exists. And so for a lot of humans, we are used to, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, plugging into systems that guide us through. Well, we're basically going to Disneyland and we get on the It's a Small World ride and it takes us through this thing and we get off at the end. So the system exists for you to experience it. I think in the world where there are not systems for things, right? Whether that is, solving unusual problems, accomplishing things that are non-linear in that way, those don't exist. And so I think what's really starting to need to happen for people is they go into these things that are hard thinking that someone is going to lead them, like I'm going to guide them along the way, and they don't, right? And so that's, I think, a lot of what happens and exists. And that's, I'd say, part of the reason why when I started teaching this class at Georgetown on how people write books, part of the reason the results were so remarkable, like 95% of my students were publishing a book, whereas 99% fail on their own, right? Why? It's because I helped them design a system in that way. And so I think that's what really comes down is it's a goal-driven world versus a systems-driven world that we need to move into to help people achieve today.
It reminds me of why people fail to write their dissertations.
Exactly.
Because, there's classwork that you have to complete in the US system, and that's a system, and you're accountable to a particular delivery, timetable. And then when you get to the dissertation, there's no system.
Yeah, that's right.
And people kind of don't know what to do.
And the world, I think, in many cases, rewards people who are able to succeed without structure, right? They reward it, right? Those are the people that are promoted. Those are the people that, get funding for companies. Like, that's the thing behind it. And so I think, I think about this a lot today with my kids, right? I've got young kids. I've got an 11, 9, and 6-year-old. And I think a lot in the world of AI, and I think of the world, like, what are they actually going to need to do to thrive? And so it really is unstructured problem solving, right? It's a sense where you get a problem and there's not a structure that you can just plug into. How do you navigate through that? So a lot of the when I started this course on book writing for my students, the funny thing is like there was no system out there that I could find, right? I mean, I'd never written books, but I'd written my own, but I'd never like seen a system. And so what I did is I took the principles of the lean startup, the entrepreneurial approach, and I applied that system to the world of books and be like, oh my God, you're a genius. No, I just found a system that I knew worked and I took it and I modified it for what that is. So that systems level thinking, I think, is very, very important. And I think that's what the people in the inflection points do is they're able to take a complicated, hard problem, perception of that problem is it's hard, and they're able to systematize it and complete it. And therefore people say, wow, like you're awesome. Like their perception of your grid is very high, and therefore they give you opportunities.
Yeah, for those listening, the name of the company is Manuscripts, and one of the things I find really interesting about the company is that it is a B Corp, and I wanted to talk to you about that because I've had people on who have been involved in B Corps before. I don't know I know the process, that there's a certification process. I know how arduous it is, but what led to the decision to take this company and make it a B Corp because you didn't have to?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the origin of Manuscripts, like I said, was about 10 years ago or so now, I guess 9 years ago. I started this class at Georgetown and I started helping people write books. And people, the outcomes for these students was remarkable. People were getting TED Talks, launching companies. They were outselling, big name authors without a big audience, right? Right. So it was a really fascinating thing. So suddenly this word got out that this guy has a system to help people write books, right? In that sort of way. And so everyone and their mother wanted to come sit in my class. All these people, friends from high school, hey, can I sit in your class? And so I didn't really have a great answer. And so during the pandemic, the world changed. And so suddenly the world was looking for, something to hold their attention when the world had changed. So I decided to open this up. So I turned this into an online experience. And really what I wanted to do is I wanted to make this accessible to more people. And so the key thing is I wasn't in the world of books. I was in the world of education. And so what I really wanted to say is okay, this is a mission that I have to help people do books. Right. And so we decided to form as a B corporation with a real important mission. And our mission really was to empower more underheard authors in books and publishing. Part of the thing that we know about books in particular is that if you have a friend who's published a family member who's published a book, if you've had that access, you can figure out the system a lot easier than if you don't. And so a lot of what was neat about our community is about 40 to 50% of our authors are authors from kind of underheard backgrounds in publishing. These are authors of color. These are authors from international places. And so a lot of our mission is to say, how can we empower more modern authors? So we made that choice to do it really because it's core to our mission. We're an education first organization. And so it felt like a nice derivation from spinning out of Georgetown into its own thing. But number two, the mission is really clear. I believe that more people should be able to write and publish a book if it's something that means something to them, is meaningful to them. And so we wanted to build a system to make that happen. It was surprisingly arduous. It was a 2.5 year process to do it. You have to open your books. You have to do all these things. You have to certify your mission. Right. You have to, all these kind of things. It's not just your mission, but you have to have employees, and you have to have customers, and you have to have environmental stuff. So it was a big thing. We just recertified again, or just got recertified this year. But it's I think it's worth doing. And I think ultimately, especially because my whole philosophy is I believe that what we're building is a type of an adult learning environment that colleges can't support. And so I tell people really what I want people to do when they, come and write a book with me is to think about this as a 1-year master's program where it's the outcome though is not just you have a degree, it's that you have a book, you have proof of your excellence, and you start on your inflection point. And so I really view it as a new approach of adult learning that I think really is based on those principles of inflection points. And so my design of this is how can I use a book to help people manufacture their inflection points with the system? And that's kind of why it works in the way that it does.
In some ways, I don't know how familiar you are with this image I'm going to describe, but it's a Norman Rockwell painting of the individual at a town hall meeting standing up because he has something to say, right? You know what I'm talking about? And for some reason, that image kind of pops in my head because it feels like there are a lot of people who feel like they have something to say and they don't feel like they're being listened to, heard, or know how to express it. And social media, for whatever its positives or negatives, provides an outlet for that. But this, the idea of an adult learning environment through which one can learn how to not just express, but connect and, disseminate. Because, I have a podcast and I can express and it's fine. But the idea of being heard is different than writing or talking. And so how can I be heard by a broadest audience possible and this is what your company is talking about.
Yeah. And it goes back to, again, I think that's why it's all rooted in the underpinnings of the research that we did is I think the reality of it is where I see people, there's a lot of untapped potential out in the world. People are unhappy with their job. They're not feeling like they're connecting to other people. They're not feeling like they have control. And I think the hard part behind it is that people can feel a little bit lost. And so I think historically education was a way for us to go out and learn and develop skills so that we could feel more, of more contributing member of society. We could do what we want behind it. And I think there's been a rush of people going into advanced degrees. And again, I like the fact that we're getting more education, but I think that part of what we're really not doing is we're not building as much proof, right? We're building degrees and credentials, but that doesn't prove that you are someone who, can solve problems, who has a unique network, who has a way to, again, contribute something different. And so I do think that where, some people are like, oh, you're a book company, you're a top 15 publisher. Congratulations. Like, the real thing that I'm hopeful of is that this spawns a different way to think about what it is like as an adult to learn, to grow, to invest in something. So I'm working on my 10th book now. And I view each time I do a new book as a way for me to do a 1-year master's program where I don't just come out of it with like having sit in some classes. I have proof that's elite, right? I have a top book out there that other people are part of. They can read, they can learn. So I've learned and I can put it on the shelf as proof of my learning. So I think if we retool how we all think about what's going to happen, especially in the world that's moving as quickly as it is how can you build a portfolio of your work that demonstrates your ability to solve complex problems in meaningful areas? I think that's what it's going to take to accelerate today. And I think a lot of the most interesting, unique people do this, right? Like, whatever we think of Elon Musk, I mean, he's an ultimate learner. He finds something that's a problem space and he learns. And then his outcome is he demonstrates that by usually building a company around it or experience.
Right.
Like, that to me is fascinating. And I think, how can we build that in a structured way? Not everyone can be Elon Musk who has that mindset, but I do think we're going to need a way to have continual learning to continue to iterate on our own lives and our journeys in our careers as we go.
And it goes back to one of the things you mentioned about your children with AI, right? I mean, so if the goal has been in the past to go to graduate school, let's say to get an MBA, and I'm learning in a more advanced capacity how to perform certain tasks, well, guess what, folks? Those tasks that I'm learning how to perform those are the ones at risk of being replaced by technology, says the guy from Detroit who watched it in manufacturing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so what you're describing here is what's the proof of concept of you that you can demonstrate through the portfolio of your ideas as manifest in this concrete thing of a book, right? It's like, here is me in this thing and my ideas and my unstructured problem solving. And because I agree with you that the unstructured problem solving and communication and creativity and collaboration piece is one of the crucial things that's going to differentiate us from more of the discrete tasks that in the past were the signal, right? I graduated from this business school. I am proficient in these discrete tasks. Hire me.
Right.
It's not going to be sufficient anymore.
It's the exact question that I think we have to wrestle with. And again, I'm super pro education. I'm super pro, people going to school, getting degrees and things like that. I think though that what I want people to really consider is, while they are in that learning environment or outside of that learning environment, whatever it is, doesn't really matter to me, is that I think people need to be remembering that just consuming content is not demonstration or proof of learning, right? And so I think a lot of what we have to think about as we look at how we structure education, how we structure our own learning, is that the portfolio of work, the proof, these projects, these demonstratable accomplishments are more key than ever. And if you can design learning environments that create a place where you have systems to help you demonstrate, I think we'll be all better off. That's the thing that I think about for my kids is listen, I hope they go to good schools. I hope they go to great places, but I also hope while they're there, they are building a portfolio so that when they walk into a job, they can say, well, why should I hire you? And say, well, here's how I solved this problem. And here's what I did to solve this problem. You can see the proof here. That I think is what will matter above all else, especially as we move into this kind of new era we're in.
Oh, for sure. And this is one of the things that we've done in the experience design department is for our majors, and is you need a portfolio when you leave, right?
Yep.
And as demonstration of competence, work, capacity, promise, right? And so here's the things. No, you're not in that portfolio. It's probably not going to be a 12-page research paper.
Yeah.
Unless you're going to graduate school in sociology, then good luck. But so I think as a whole, moving to this portfolio concept as a way of communicating, and in an era where, what is thought leadership, right? how do we demonstrate thought leadership? In our previous conversations, that was something I was very interested in, because a lot of people, especially ones who appear on this podcast or have their own podcast, they want to try to construct expertise as thought leadership.
Right.
Right. And so what are your thoughts of what is thought leadership today, and what's it going to be like tomorrow? And how do we recognize someone as a thought leader versus someone who's just, competent, but not necessarily advancing our thought on a topic?
It's a great question. And I think it's something that I wrestle with a lot. I mean, I think there are more and more people who are producing podcasts, they're producing books, they're producing things. How do you make sure that your things matter, right? How do you think that piece of it? And so it's something that I think a lot about today is like, how do we make sure that the information that we're delivering, the projects we're doing are not just interesting, right? Interesting is fine. I mean, again, friends and family, they're happy to buy your interesting project. They're happy to do those things. But if you really want your knowledge to advance, if you really want your knowledge to spread and move, the main thing that we have to figure out is like, what is both different and also something that is sort of spreadable. Like, how do you have those things? So the best ideas are ideas that can spread. And so a lot of what I think about in the concept of thought leadership is if you just break it down, right? You have to have sort of thought, something that's, a different, unique way, and it has to lead you somewhere, right? Those things. And so a lot of what I've really been focusing on as I work with authors and I speak to people behind it is, how do you make sure that your ideas today are not just interesting? And so a lot of where we have found that sort of the thread to be in studying people. So when you start to step back and look at, the thinkers of the world today who actually spread their knowledge through books, right? And the best analogy I give you that I think you'll appreciate a little bit is it's a lot like building a religion, right? And so, if you think about people whose ideas spread that way, so there's three things that every kind of religion or movement needs. Number one, you need a preacher. You need a person who's going to be out there spreading the message, not just in the book, but they're out there talking about it, they're sharing it. Like, humans learn from those ways. So you need a preacher. Number two, you need, rituals. You need something that you're going to teach them. There's a way of behaving, acting, thinking behind it. And number three, you need a book so that those people who follow it can spread it for you. And that's really what it takes behind it. So a lot of when you think about like how you package up a knowledge movement today is really what you need to identify is two different things. So when we think about what are the books that spread, there's really two different ways that we see people kind of carving out new knowledge today. Number one, you can teach people how to be a new type of person, a person you could aspire to be, or a new type of action, an action you could aspire to do. So type of person, type of action. And so when we studied thousands and thousands of the most movement-driven books, they typically would all do one of these two things. And the more explicit they were, the better. So the examples of books and sort of, thought leaders who would sort of describe a new type of person: Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell,
right?
Originals by Adam Grant, The Go-Giver by Bob Berg, Untamed by Glennon Doyle, right? These are people you could aspire to be. The other one is actions you could aspire to do. Start with Why by Simon Sinek, Brave the Wilderness by Brene Brown, Eat, Pray, Love by Liz Gilbert, Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, Think Fast and Slow by Dan Kahneman. So the idea really, I think, is as you're designing knowledge that can spread, is it has to be something that is simple enough to understand, right? All those concepts are ones that when I say it, you don't need to have a ton of information to understand it, number one. So all those have that like simplicity, but they also have an intrigue in them that you want to share. So, the idea of start with why, I understand it, but it's also different, right? There's something about I want to talk about, or outliers.
Right.
Like, it's like, well, I get what an outlier is and I want to talk about it to other people. So I think as we think about how you demonstrate thought leadership, and many times giving people a framework is what I try to do with the book, is identify like what is the new thing that you're teaching that is simple but intriguing. Like, and that combination is really where we use category design and the concept of designing, books that can create thought leadership. Is that helping people identify, are you teaching a type of person that others can aspire to be, or are you teaching a type of action that others can aspire to do? And I think once you have those frameworks in front of you, it makes the process of building knowledge that is kind of word of mouthable, which is sort of what that idea of creating movements behind your knowledge really matter and really ultimately require.
I just thought of a tagline for your company. You're free to use it. It's like, Manuscripts is like the margarine of ideas. It's way more spreadable. It's not like the hard butter. I mean, especially in winter when you put it on the bread and it tears the bread because it's, it creates a hole and it's just a mess. But it's like the margarine of ideas that helps it become more spreadable.
Can't believe it's not butter. That's what.
Can't believe it's not manuscripts. If it was manuscripts, it would be more spreadable. One of the things that you triggered me on was the idea of interesting, because I can't tell you how many times that I've been at a party or I've been in I never go to parties. That's a lie. I've been around other people and they say, what do you do for a living? Or I teach, college, or what do you teach? And I tell them, well, that's so interesting. That is so, it sounds so interesting. That's very interesting. Okay. Hire me. No. I mean, it's this gap between it's interesting and it's something that I really am motivated to change from.
That's right.
And I can talk interesting all day, but it's an important gap to recognize. There's a difference between interesting and, transformational.
Yeah.
Change agent.
I think a lot of it does come down to that, right? And we're in this information world. There's tons and tons of information. And
a lot of interesting.
Yeah, it's most of it is interesting, if that, right? In that sense. So, and I think that's really what is important to know is, especially when you think about creating movements behind books and those things, is that you have to have something that has that, again, that the category. You can own this thing behind it. And then it does require depth, right? Part of it, I think, is to say, I teach this thing is fine. Like, it's like, yeah, that's interesting, right? Versus part of it is when people can internalize it for themselves. So, I wrote a book fairly recently called Super Mentors. And Super Mentors talks about a very modern approach to mentorship. And so when people ask me about my book, I say I wrote a book about mentors. And the next question that I ask is, so do you have a mentor? And they typically get really squeamish in that way. And they kind of like, I had this person behind it along the way. And I say, do you think a mentor could help you? And they're like, absolutely. And I was like, well, how would you get a super mentor behind it? And then they don't know. And so then they pause. The next thing you know is like, could we do a call? Like that's what happens next. And so I think a lot of what that is, and I'll tell you, like, it was a process for me to find that gap in the market. But the real thing to know is you have to create an uncomfortable tension in people, right? If you want them to really like start to want to go deeper into it, you can't you can't do transformation from a pithy title, right? Like start with why doesn't drive transformation. But what it does is it creates an internal tension. We call it cognitive friction. So it creates cognitive friction so that you feel like, well, how do I do that one? And then what a great book does is it creates cognitive fluency. So this shift is cognitive friction means like, I want that, but I don't quite understand or know how. And so I'm creating a discomfort into the ability to create that fluency. And so the fluency comes from having a framework associated with it. So you need something that's intriguing, and then you need a framework that helps people create fluency to unfrictionize, I guess, or to oil up the thing that they want. And that's really what happens in great books, great ideas, great pieces of it, is that they tap into a deep cognitive friction and they're able to help provide cognitive fluency to move through that very quickly.
So I changed my tagline. So now it's Manuscripts is the WD-40 for cognitive friction.
We oil you up, we spread you. It's
that's a different podcast now.
Yeah, different podcast.
The oiling up and spreading. I don't know if that's what I want to go into, although it might be more profitable.
Could be.
Yeah, right. I'll have to think about that and put that into ChatGPT and see what ideas that comes up with if it doesn't get tagged as obscene.
True that.
But it is, the idea of creating friction, and this is another thing that sociologists often are known for, is why we don't get invited to parties. We're really good at demonstrating friction.
That's right.
But not solution.
That's right. Yeah.
It's like, here's what's wrong. Someone might say, oh, I saw this TV show, it was really good. And the sociologist goes, have you ever thought about this part of it? And now it doesn't do that. And so we're really good at pointing out what's wrong, but translating that into fluency, into action for change, into transformation.
Right.
And I would blame that on the fact that we're embedded in more of an academic model of communication, which then renders us outside of most conversations. Mm-hmm. So this idea of public intellectualism or public scholarship or public engagement to spread these ideas, which is another thing I think about the model you're working with in a new model of communication, is breaking down the barriers of intellectual discourse into a broader, cultural fluency to create cognitive fluency. So, I mean, it's something we're not taught how to do in grad school, but I do think if I was a dean, which I never will be, that would be one change I would institute, is becoming fluent in more than one communication style and language.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that universities wrestle with, and again, we could talk on that for hours. But a colleague of mine at Georgetown is Cal Newport, who's a sort of a well-known author, and he and I've talked quite a bit about the challenge between what's recognized in institutions is published research in these things, and so people do what they're incentivized to do in that way.
Right.
And so I think a lot of times the idea of creating research that is designed to appeal to the academy is different than trying to create research and thought that is to appeal to the mass market. And so it's a tension that I think universities wrestle with. And again, I don't have the answers. I'm not in the academy enough to even make a point of it. But I do think that if you want your knowledge to matter, it can't just be interesting. It has to be something that creates an intrigue and a willingness to be uncomfortable in it, and then ultimately find a way to solve it with fluency. That is, I think, as anyone, whether they're in the academy or not, is important. Is if you want your ideas to matter, you have to be able to make someone uncomfortable because they feel it. There's something off about it, and then ultimately give them a framework, a system, an approach that could help them solve that discomfort quite quickly, honestly.
Well, luckily I have the answer. And the answer goes back to what you just said is, how do we measure success? And that's something you previously mentioned, is if we measure impact solely by Q rating or the number of citations in other academic journals, that's what you're going to get. If you measure impact by other factors, whether it be podcast downloads or blog reads or, books that lead to some kind of thought leadership, some kind of transformational discussion, cognitive fluency, you measure when you measure something, it matters. And so expanding the notion outside of the realm of the academy into broader impact starts to become the important element. And, that's a longer discussion, but if schools, I'm lucky to be at a school who values what I do on the podcast and other ways. So they get it, but most, especially R1 institutions, Research 1 institutions, they don't. And they're stuck in these models that drive them outside of having those conversations in the broader public. Which is why they should join Manuscript.
I mean, it's been fun to see. Like, I think a lot more. I'm seeing a lot more academics than even years ago now coming in and saying like, "Hey, I want this piece to matter. I want these things." So it is. I will say it's as much as this started out as a total experiment for me. We've got 3,000 published authors, 500 something national award winners, and I think what's been fascinating to see is I think that people, they do desire. Right. I think my learning about this as helping people do a really hard thing is that people want to do things that matter. They want to do things that matter. They just don't want to do them alone. And so I think that is the interesting learning that I've had is if people, you should desire to do hard things. You should desire to grow, no matter where you are, whether you're 21 or whether you're 55 or 85. But I think ultimately, if you really want to succeed at those hard things, most of the time you will need a community, you need collaborators, you'll need hope and help. And I think that's where Manuscripts has been a fun project for me to get to do.
Kind of put a bow on it. When I talk about experience design with my students, I say one of the goals of being a designer is to help make things better, right?
That's right.
For whoever our audience is. And, whether that be customer experience or, experience design in customer area or in patient and student or in information design, right? Which is what we're talking about and if I can put my ideas down in a way that can lead to this transformation, this shift, this broader change in the discourse and, create opportunities to move things along, that create a movement, then that's important. That's another part of experience design is making things better by being able to publicly engage with others around the ideas that one has, but only if you can communicate and have the network to help disseminate. Which is which is what you all are doing. Well, I really do appreciate it. I mean, I found out about you through another podcast guest. Who was a successful author. And so I said, I got to find out more. When I also found out you were a B Corp, I'm like, I definitely got to find out more. And it's just fascinating, from an educational standpoint, but also from a publishing industry standpoint, and also from a community standpoint. So I really appreciate describing and to do all the work that you do.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it's been fun. And I feel very fortunate to get to do something. I tell people I love what I get to do because ultimately publishing a book is one of the hardest things people can do objectively. Like 99% of people fail at it. So when we can help people do the hardest thing they've ever done in their lives, it's very rewarding for me, but ultimately for them. And so I feel like I've got to do something that allows me to really harness my gifts.
I want to thank Eric Koester for joining me to talk about learning experiences, inflection points, storytelling, and making positive impacts. You can find out more about his own work, his own books, which he has many, and his company Manuscript in my links in the show notes. As always, you can share any feedback on this episode or any episode at feedback@experiencexdesign.com. I'm really interested in hearing what you think about Eric's philosophy, his approach, and the stories that you have to tell and just need some help telling. And finally, if you want to subscribe to the EXD newsletter and join the EXD community, head over to experiencexdesign.com, provide me with your email, and I'll make sure to keep you in the loop. And while you're there, you can also buy me a coffee to help defray the cost of this podcast so I can keep bringing this content to you. I mean, the reality is that whether you donate or not, I'll keep bringing this content to you. But a donation sure is appreciated. Another thing you can do for me, if not a donation, is you can bring me to your next event. If it's a keynote, if it's a corporate training, if it's a brown bag lunch or anything else where you think my insights and my ability to communicate would be helpful, just let me know. You can connect with me at gary@garyconnects.com or DM me through LinkedIn, and we can get the process rolling and I can help you achieve your experience design goals. And with that, as always, remember, be safe, be kind, be well, and be here for the next Experience by Design podcast. Bye.